I bought this paint when I first started out doing watercolour, and I think it cost me around $24 Australian for a set of 12, whereas one of these Daniel Smith tubes of paint can cost almost the same amount. So if you're in that state where you're not quite sure whether it's worth upgrading for you, then in today's video I'm going to be doing the same painting, the same subject matter on the same type of paper, and the only difference is going to be the type of paint that I'm using. When I started this one, I'll be honest, I didn't have much hope for the cheap paints, especially because when I was trying to put the sky in, it was really hard to get a saturated blue, and with the Daniel Smith paints it was just so much easier to get a nice saturated result, and I ended up having to use a lot more paint and a lot more pigment with the cheaper paints, so that is something to bear in mind. The whole thing at this point was looking like it was in Daniel Smith's favour. When I got onto the second layer, things were looking a little bit better for the cheap paints. The oranges were looking quite saturated and nice in the cheap paints section, which I was quite surprised with, to be honest, and I was actually pleasantly surprised with how this part went down. The problem became when I tried to spray it with water and the cheaper paints just went a little bit weird. With the Daniel Smith paints it was a lot easier to achieve that nice smooth watered out effect that I like to get with clouds, and I had to work a bit harder with the cheaper paints to achieve the same effect. Also, when I dabbed out a little bit of the paint with the tissue, which I like to do with clouds as well, it was just a little bit difficult to lift out some of that colour with the cheaper paints, whereas with the Daniel Smith paints it did lift a bit easier. When I got to this stage, which was just doing the sea and the mountains in the background, I actually couldn't find too much different between the two paints, because this is quite an unsaturated area, so the differences between the two weren't as obvious. If there are any differences, it might just be because I was applying them badly, but let's just pretend that that didn't happen. And I think the rest of this section ended up looking pretty similar between the two paints. So at this point I was starting to get a bit confused, because I thought the Daniel Smith paints would just perform better in every single category, but it actually started to surprise me. And then we got onto this third layer, which is where I applied the darkest darks. I used a mixture of burnt umber and ultramarine blue for both of these, and they actually performed very similarly. I was quite impressed with how dark I could get these trees in the background with the cheaper paints, and yeah, there really just wasn't much difference between the two when I got to this stage, so I was quite surprised about that. And I guess there wasn't too much saturation in this layer either, so that just might be why it performed a bit better. So ultimately, I think anything that doesn't have too much saturation in it, you might be able to achieve a similar result with some cheaper art supplies. But if you do want to get to those sort of highly saturated bits of your painting, then you might want to think about investing in some more expensive paints. You'll also notice that the reflection in the window on the Daniel Smith's painting looks a lot more interesting and bright, and that is just also because of the saturation and the fact that that yellow just came through a lot stronger with the Daniel Smith, so that ultimately meant that the reflections looked a lot nicer, in my opinion, on the Daniel Smith section. But when you consider how different in price these two paints are, it really is quite surprising to see these results, because the two paintings in my eyes look very similar. Let me know in the comments if you agree that they look similar, or if you can really tell a difference between the two. I'll be interested to hear what you think about that. I think ultimately what I want to leave you with in this video is that watercolor really isn't about having the most expensive art supplies. The one thing that I would say you need to at least spend a bit of money on is paper. You can get away with cheap paints, as this I think is showing, but you can't get away with cheap paper. So I was doing both of these on the same sheet of Arches paper, and I think that really helped with the cheaper paints and helping them to look a little bit more professional, just because it behaved how I wanted it to, because the paper that I was painting on was pretty good. So I think this shows that you really don't need to spend a lot of money on paint, especially if you're just getting started. And I think ultimately the real thing is to just make sure you're doing lots of practice. And with watercolour, it really is just practice makes perfect. And I think when I first started using these Reeves paints, I just hadn't had enough experience. And I put that down to the paints being bad, but it just was that I hadn't had enough practice with it yet. So I think this shows, if anything, that no matter what kind of paints you have, from the really cheap ones to the more expensive ones, you can achieve the results that you want if you put in enough practice. So that's what I want to leave you with today. I know it's a bit hypocritical because I personally spend way too much money on art supplies, but I think it's something that I'm going to try to remember as I head into 2021. Is that less is more, and it really doesn't matter what supplies you're using. It just matters that you're practicing hard and constantly trying to improve your art. I started this channel in 2020, so if you're one of my OG 2020 subscribers, thank you so much for all the support that I've seen this year, and I'll see you in the next video.